Some saints come out of the womb already glowing, floating 3 inches off the ground, ready for stained glass windows. Not this guy. This one was born barefoot in the mud, hands covered in sheep dung, talking with a thick country drawl nobody in Paris could place. He chased pigs before he ever chased souls. He was ashamed of being poor. He chased money. He got lost. He got scared. He spent time in chains. And that's exactly why God picked him. We call him Saint Vincent de Paul now, but for most of his life he was just Vincent, a regular guy from the wrong side of nowhere who knew what it felt like to be hungry and looked down on. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the true story of a kid who started out herding hogs in a forgotten corner of France and ended up bringing an entire kingdom to its knees, not with swords, but with a bowl of warm soup, a crust of bread, and one sentence he kept repeating: "The poor are our lords and masters." This is the story of a fire that started in dry grass and is still burning 400 years later. Close your eyes for just a second. Smell the salt wind, the wet wool, the wood smoke. Hear the sheep bleating on the moors. We're going back to 1581, to a little cluster of houses called Ronquin. And we're going to follow that barefoot shepherd boy all the way to the day half of Paris stood weeping outside a plain wooden coffin. You ready? Then listen close. Part 1. In the spring of 1581, down in the sandy, wind-bitten Landes country of southwestern France, a third son was born to Jean de Paul and Bertrand de Demora, in a little cluster of houses called Ronquin, just outside the village of Puy. They named him Vincent. Nothing about that crying baby hinted he'd one day be called the Apostle of Charity. He looked like every other kid around, barefoot, sunburned, already marked for hard work. The land was poor, the pine forests went on forever, and the ocean wind carried salt 20 miles inland. As soon as Vincent could toddle, they handed him a stick and put him in charge of the hogs and a handful of scrappy sheep. Mornings started before dawn. Days ended when the stars came out. He learned real fast that life doesn't hand you anything. You wrestle it out of the dirt, one back-breaking day at a time. Home was quiet in the way poor country homes are quiet. Nobody wasted words. His father Jean was a tough man. Not mean, just clear-eyed. He could read the weather, count every penny, and he had figured out something most sharecropper families never dared to believe. One boy who learned to read and write might someday lift the whole family out of the mud. Vincent was the one they picked. Not the strongest, but the quickest. He could memorize a hymn after hearing it once, remember every price at the Dax market, and ask questions that left grown-ups tongue-tied. One day, he must have been 9 or 10, Vincent came home from selling a couple of hogs in town, handed his father the coins, and said straight out, "Dad, I want to go to school." Jean didn't laugh. He looked at the boy, then at the thin fields, then at the sky, and finally nodded. That nod cost them everything they could borrow or sell. Land mortgaged, oxen gone, years of rye bread and watery soup. But the deal was made. At 14, Vincent left home with a small bundle on his back. First stop was the Franciscan friars in Dax, then the house of a lawyer named Decome, who ran a little boarding school. Vincent swept floors, Cooked beans waited on table, anything to cover his keep, while he crammed Latin and rhetoric into his head from dawn till dark. Some nights he'd walk past the fine stone houses of the rich folks and smell fresh wheat bread drifting out the windows. He'd blush crimson. He'd blush his whole life whenever he felt small, and then go back to his books. One memory burned deeper than all the rest. Wintertime, on the road home to Ronquin, he met a beggar half frozen on the side of the path. Vincent only had a few coins he'd earned watching somebody else's flock. He gave them all. When he got home empty-handed, his father laid into him. "We're barely scraping by, Vincent. You trying to starve us so you can play the saint?" The boy looked up, calm as you please, and answered, "But Dad, he was poorer than we are." Jean turned away, poked the fire, and didn't say another word. Something shifted in the room that night. That's how Vincent grew up, straddling hard-scrabble earth and a stubborn dream of something better. He never lost the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. He never lost that slow, rolling Gascon accent that made fancy Parisians smile later on. And he never forgot what it feels like to be hungry, cold, and looked down on because your hands are dirty and your French sounds like the barnyard. Years later, when the whole world called him Monsieur Vincent, and sisters in rough gray habits were walking the streets of Paris caring for abandoned babies and chained-up galley slaves, he still remembered the little shepherd boy from Ronquin who once gave every cent he had to a stranger on a winter road. Because he knew. He'd been there. Part 2. The Proud Young Priest Who Lost His Way, 1600 to 1617. By the time Vincent was 19, he looked like he had it all figured out. He'd been ordained a priest faster than anybody thought possible. Too fast, really. The bishop gave him a special dispensation because the boy was brilliant and the family needed the income. A priest could claim a benefice, a steady paycheck from some little church or abbey, even if he never set foot in it. That was the plan. Vincent grabbed the first one he could, a broken-down abbey near Bidache that didn't pay much, then chased rumors of a richer one in the Pyrenees that belonged to a dead uncle. He even went to Rome for a few months, eyes wide at the marble and the cardinals, thinking maybe the big city held the golden ticket. He wore the black cassock like a young man wears a new suit, proud, a little stiff, convinced the world was finally noticing him. For a while it worked. He studied law in Toulouse, rented a room with curtains, ate meat on Fridays when nobody was looking. People started calling him Monsieur l'Abbé de Paul. He liked the sound of that. But every night, when the house got quiet, something gnawed at him. He'd light a candle, open his breviary, and try to pray. The words felt like pebbles in his mouth. He'd think about the sheep back home, the smell of wood smoke, his father's cracked hands, and he'd feel ashamed. Ashamed of wanting comfort. Ashamed of wanting to be important. Ashamed that he was running after money and titles the same way the rich boys in Dax used to run after pretty girls. Then came the storm. In 1605, while traveling between Toulouse and Bordeaux, some say to collect an inheritance, some say to dodge creditors, Vincent was captured by Turkish pirates off the coast of Nîmes. 3 ships, black sails, men shouting in languages he didn't know. They chained him below deck with a couple hundred other terrified souls and sailed east. 7 months in Tunis as a slave. 7 months of sun that blistered. Chains that bit. Masters who beat you if you looked up too slow. He was sold twice. The second owner was a renegade Christian who had turned Muslim to save his skin. That man's wife liked to listen to Vincent sing the Salve Regina in the evenings, the only Latin she still remembered from childhood. One night she asked her husband, "Why does the Christian slave sing like his heart is free when his body is in chains?" That question haunted the owner. A year later, he helped Vincent and 2 others escape in a little boat under cover of night. They rowed until their hands bled, landed in France half dead, and Vincent walked into the French port looking like a scarecrow with a priest's collar. People expected a grand story of miracles and bravery. Vincent hardly talked about it. He just said, "God allowed it. I needed it." But something had cracked wide open inside him. Back in France, he drifted. Paris, Rome again, Paris again, taking whatever job paid. Tutor to rich kids, chaplain to a countess, parish priest in a tiny village called Châtillon. He was 35 now, still handsome, still brilliant, still restless. And then, one scorching Sunday in August 1617, everything changed forever. He was preaching in that little church when a woman burst in, crying that a whole family on the edge of town was dying. Fever, no food, no one brave enough to go near them because sickness was catching. Vincent stopped in the middle of his sermon. He looked out at the congregation. Good, church-going people who crossed themselves beautifully and then walked past beggars every day. Something snapped. He told them, voice shaking with anger and tears, "We are all murderers if we leave these people to die." Then he walked straight out of the church, down the dusty road, and into that sick house himself. By nightfall, the whole village was there, bringing soup, blankets, medicine, ashamed and on fire at the same time. Vincent stood in the middle of it all, covered in sweat and somebody else's vomit. And for the first time in his life, he felt the thing he'd been chasing since he was a barefoot shepherd boy. He was exactly where God wanted him. That night he wrote in a letter to a friend, "I have been a priest for 17 years, and I think only today I began to be one." The proud young abbé who wanted titles and comfort was dying. Something fiercer, humbler, and infinitely more alive was being born. And France would never be the same again. Part 3. The Fire Spreads, 1617 to 1633. Word got around fast. There was a priest in the middle of nowhere who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. By the fall of 1617, Vincent had left the little parish of Châtillon and was living in the grand chateau of the Gondi family, one of the richest and most powerful clans in France. Madame de Gondi, everyone just called her the General, had heard about the sick family and the village that suddenly woke up. She wanted that man as chaplain for her household and spiritual director for herself. Vincent tried to say no. He was terrified of going back to fancy houses with silk curtains and silver spoons. But she wouldn't take no for an answer, and her husband, Philippe Emmanuel de Gondi, was the general of the king's galleys, the man in charge of every chained convict rowing the royal warships. When the general asks, you go. So Vincent moved into the chateau and promptly turned the place upside down. He started preaching to the servants the same way he preached to the nobles, no watered-down version. He made the Countess cry in confession because he refused to flatter her. And every time the family traveled across their huge estates, Vincent insisted on stopping in every filthy village along the road. He'd climb down from the coach, cassock hitched up, and go door to door asking, "Who's sick? Who's dying? Who hasn't had a priest in 20 years?" The peasants didn't know what to make of him. He looked like a gentleman, talked like a peasant, and smelled faintly of sheep no matter how much perfume the servants tried to put on him. They opened their doors. Then they opened their hearts. Soon the roads were full of priests walking behind Vincent, barefoot in summer, half frozen in winter, preaching missions that lasted 2 or 3 weeks in each village. They taught catechism with a system so simple even children could understand it. Vincent called it his little method. They heard confessions from dawn till midnight. Old feuds ended. Marriages got put back together. People who hadn't taken communion in 40 years wept like babies at the altar. Vincent named them the Congregation of the Mission. Everybody else started calling them Lazarists or Vincentians. Their motto was straight out of the Gospel: Evangelizzare pauperibus misit me. He sent me to preach good news to the poor. But preaching wasn't enough for Vincent anymore. In Paris, he walked the streets at night and saw babies left in doorways to die of cold. He started picking them up himself. 1 night, 2 nights, 10 nights. Soon there were 13 abandoned infants crying in his room. The neighbors complained about the smell. Vincent just smiled and said, "Good. Now we're starting to look like the gospel." He went to the richest ladies in Paris, the same ones who wore dresses that cost more than a farmer made in a lifetime, and told them flat out, "Mesdames, your salvation is waiting under the bridges of Paris." Then he put them to work washing pus-soaked bandages and feeding orphans. They called themselves the Dames de Charité. Some quit after the first week. The ones who stayed changed France. And still Vincent felt it wasn't enough. He kept remembering the galleys, the chained men he'd seen as a boy when his father took him to port, the ones he'd heard about from Monsieur de Gondi. Men branded on the face, rowing until their lungs gave out, forgotten by God and everybody else. One day in 1625, he looked at a young peasant girl named Louise de Marillac, widow, brilliant, half crippled by anxiety attacks, and said, "Mademoiselle, the poor need sisters, not just ladies who visit once a month. Sisters who live with them, who aren't afraid of lice or blood or swearing. Are you crazy enough to try?" Louise looked him in the eye and said, "With the grace of God, yes." That yes became the Daughters of Charity, peasant girls in gray dresses and white cornets who would one day be found on every battlefield, in every plague hospital, in every slum from Paris to Peking. Vincent told them, "Your convent will be the houses of the sick, your chapel the parish church, your cloister, the streets of the city." By 1633, when Vincent was 52 years old, the fire he had carried since that winter road in Ronquin had become a wildfire. He still had the same rough hands, the same Gascon accent, the same blush when someone praised him too much. But now when he walked through Paris, beggars kissed the hem of his cassock, and great lords got out of his way. He never wanted to be famous. He just wanted the poor to stop being forgotten. And for a little while, just 12 more years, France listened. Part 4. The Saint Who Refused to Die a Saint, 1633 to 1660. By the time Vincent turned 52, Paris knew his step before they saw his face. Quick, uneven, always in a hurry, like he was late for an appointment with somebody dying. He was never healthy again after the slave years. Fevers came and went. His legs swelled so bad some days he had to be carried in a chair. He slept 3 or 4 hours a night on a straw mattress so thin you could feel the boards. When people begged him to take a softer bed, he laughed. The Son of Man had nowhere to lay his head. Who am I to complain? The work only grew. Foundlings poured in by the hundreds now. The Daughters of Charity, those country girls in gray, were running from sunrise to sunrise. Hospitals, battlefields, prisons, the worst slums of Paris. Vincent walked the wards every week, kissing leprous hands, holding dying convicts so they wouldn't be alone when the last breath came. He still blushed crimson if anyone called him holy. He kept starting things nobody else had dared. Tuesday conferences for priests. Every week, hundreds of tired, discouraged clerics crowded into Saint-Lazare, the old leper house that had become the mother house of the mission, just to hear Vincent talk for an hour about how to preach simply, how to love the poor without romantic nonsense, how to stay human when the world wants to make you a statue. Retreats for men about to be ordained, 10 days of silence, prayer, and Vincent walking among them like an old shepherd, asking each one, "Young man, do you know what you're doing? Because if you ever hurt one of these little ones, it would be better for you to tie a millstone around your neck." He fought bishops when they lived like princes. He fought the powerful ladies when they started treating charity like a fashion. He fought his own priests when they got proud. He fought himself most of all, every single day. One winter night in 1657, he found a beggar boy frozen to death under a bridge. Vincent carried the body in his own arms to the church, laid it on the altar steps, and wept in front of everybody. Then he went straight to the king's council and made them listen until they voted money for a new shelter. He was 76 and looked 90. In the summer of 1660, the end came quietly. He had a stroke while hearing a poor woman's confession in a garret. They carried him home to Saint-Lazare. For 2 months he lay in a tiny room, breathing like a broken bellows, refusing anything that wasn't given to the poorest patient first. On the night of September 27th, the whole house was awake. Sisters knelt in the corridors. Priests stood in silence. Outside, half of Paris crowded the street, rich and poor together, because word had spread. Monsieur Vincent was dying. He opened his eyes once more, looked around at all the tear-streaked faces, and managed a little smile. "Don't cry," he whispered in that old Gascon accent. "I'm just going to see the poor in heaven, and beg them to forgive me." Then he said the only thing he ever said about himself that sounded like pride. "God has been very good to such a wretched sinner." And he died. They buried him in a plain wooden coffin under the chapel floor. Within weeks, miracles started happening at the tomb. The king came. The Queen Mother came. All Paris came. But the real miracle was already walking the earth. Thousands of priests and sisters who had learned from an old shepherd boy that love isn't a feeling. It's sleeves rolled up at 3 in the morning. It's giving your last piece of bread. It's kissing wounds nobody else will touch. 400 years later, you can still find them. Gray habits with white wings in hospital corridors, black cassocks in the worst neighborhoods. Ordinary people who heard the story of the little boy from Honquin who once gave away every coin he had because someone was poorer than he was. And somewhere, Vincent is still blushing crimson, shaking his head, muttering under his breath, "I was nothing. It was all grace." But grace had chosen the right shepherd, and the fire still burns.